my name is Dan Shimolinski. People like to call me Shimmy, and you can too. And welcome back to Sample School, our deep dive into Soundpaint. Now, we have covered a vast amount of information thus far, browsing and loading parts, using settings in the per part window, the racks, the effects, and using the arpeggiator sequencer. And on the surface, you may be looking at the screen going, what's left to explain? But today we will be talking about the magic under the hood of Soundpaint, getting things moving to make your programs that much more special. Oh yes, I am talking about modulation. Now, to modulate something means to vary the strength, character, maybe the pitch of your sound. Modulation is the ability to control parameters, sometimes multiple parameters at a single time, using control surfaces, MIDI commands, or sometimes just automation. We're gonna cover the three main types of modulation that you find in Soundpaint and talk about what makes them extra special. But first, we're gonna need to establish some key vocabulary. Now, you might remember this first one from when we were talking about racks. I said we would come back to it at a later video. And the parameter I'm talking about is an LFO. I'm gonna go into the rack section and load an LFO here. You see we have 8 of them. And talking about LFOs requires you to understand some basics about analog synthesizers. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. Because on a synthesizer, the main generators of tone, of sound, are referred to as oscillators. Oscillators generate tones in different wave shapes, and every wave sounds slightly different. So for example, I've loaded the sawtooth wave, which is very characteristically buzzy and kind of gritty. But that sounds very different than a square wave, which sounds a little more hollow and round, which sounds different from a triangle wave, which sounds a little more subby, a little more like a sine wave, smoother, not as many upper harmonics. And the reason that you are able to hear that sound is because the oscillator is vibrating at a frequency that is so fast that it actually generates a tone. We can use the LFO module to look at what some of these wave shapes actually would look like on an oscilloscope when you're actually playing them. This is a sine wave, this is a square wave, this is a sawtooth wave, and this is a triangle. So everybody knows that A440, the tuning note, right, is vibrating at 440 hertz. That is the speed at which an oscillator is vibrating that wave shape, giving us that characteristic sound. But what makes LFOs different from a normal oscillator is that it is a low frequency oscillator, meaning it is vibrating at a low frequency, not a fast frequency like 440 hertz. Because LFOs vibrate at such a low speed, on their own, they don't actually generate a steady tone. And to that you might say, well, what's the purpose of an oscillator that you can't hear? The purpose of an oscillator that you can't hear is that it creates motion in a cyclical, consistent fashion at a speed that is consistent as well. It allows you to modulate different aspects of Soundpaint. If you think of an oscillator as a wheel, and maybe the wheel isn't perfectly round, visualize that wheel spinning around over and over and over again. Then place a flat surface above that wheel. What's gonna happen to that surface as the wheel is spinning is the surface will go up and down, kind of mimicking the shape of the bend in that wheel. This is what a low frequency oscillator is. But I think you'll start to understand as we use it practically. And with that, I welcome you to our LFO module in the rack section. Let's start at the very top where it says destination or dest. If I click this little I, you'll see that this LFO is currently not assigned to any control. Because if we're going with our wheel analogy and we want to change something, we have to tell Soundpaint what we'd like to change. What is that flat surface that slowly moves? Is it the pitch of the instrument? The clearest way for you to hear what an LFO does is to probably assign it to the pitch of a part. So that pitch right now is nice and steady, but maybe I want to give it a little shake. I want to give it a little motion, a little vibrato, if you will. We can use an LFO to do that. Now, when you click the I on destination, you can see to assign a destination, right-click on a control, e.g. a volume slider, and choose Add LFO Automation. So I'm gonna go ahead and right-click on the pitch slider, and you'll see that I have Add LFO Automation. Instantly, that slider starts moving. And now our part's gonna sound like this. Now in this menu, we can see we have pretty much the same controls that we have in our module on the left side here, but we have 2 additional controls here, destination range and reverse behavior. The range is how far you're going to let that oscillator change the pitch. So as you can see, that slider is going hard right to hard left, 100% to negative 100%. And because the micro pitch bends about a whole step, we're getting a whole step vibrato. Now you can see that the shape that we have selected here is a sine wave. And this is where you can start to really use your visual cues and your imagination on what this looks like under the surface. Because the pitch is actually doing that. Now let me ask you, if I switch this sine wave to a square wave, what do you think is gonna happen? Instead of being nice and smooth and swoopy, we've got these two kind of hard edges. Watch the slider of the micro pitch as I change the wave from sine to square. Boom. And now, my pitch sounds like this. Isn't that cool? Now what about a sawtooth wave? Sawtooth is almost kind of a ramp shape, right? The full cycle is literally a drop straight down and then quickly resetting back to the top. Watch the micro pitch slider as I click on that. It follows the shape of the wave. And what that sounds like is this. This is probably a good time to talk about bias because we're going from top to bottom, right? We can change the bias to the opposite direction to get the wave going the other way. Triangle is very similar to a sine wave, except instead of it being silky smooth at the top and bottom, it will hit and come back down. You can see it's more of a harder ping pong, like the ball is bouncing back and forth. It's bouncing off of either side. As we make this faster, you'll hear more of a difference between that and the sine wave, but you can see it, right? Ping pong, ping pong. And then finally we have the die, which we know from the other die that we have in our interface. This means random. It's picking random integers within this range. So very, very different shapes, a wide range of shapes to choose from to modulate something in Soundpaint. If I want it to go faster, I can change the frequency. Right now we are at 1 hertz, so very not audible. If I want to bump that speed up, I can raise the frequency. And if I don't want as much, if I am trying to create like a vibrato effect, and I find that a full whole step is a little too wide of a vibrato, there are 2 ways I can affect that. The first is to change the range, so the max left-right parameter that this LFO can push. And by the way, one cool little trick, you can grab this arrow and change the center of where it's vibrating. But for a vibrato like this, I'm gonna keep it pretty much in the dead center of the pitch. So that's one way to control the amount of vibrato. I can also use this slider here, which literally changes the amount of the vibrato. Now, if you want that vibrato to happen at a speed that matches your project, your main DAW, whatever production you're working on, you do have a sync option, which changes this frequency from hertz to a note value. So if you've got a tempo of like 120 and you want it to vibrate perfect eighth notes, you can do that. And you'll notice now that we have this LFO assigned, there's no more like little information clicker saying you don't have a destination for it. And if you want to load the more in-depth viewer with the range, you can go ahead and click on just destination, or you can right click on the parameter that you're assigning it to and see that the active LFO is currently LFO number 1, and click there to see it as well. Now the really cool thing about LFOs are, you have 8 of these. You can assign them to most everywhere in Soundpaint, every changeable parameter, and you can assign single LFOs to multiple places. So let's say I wanna also assign this LFO1, or SRC, which stands for source, to my volume control. I can right click on that, add LFO automation, and choose LFO source 1. I can change the destination range of this assignment and it will not affect the range of the assignment I've just set for pitch. So I can have the same LFO at the same speed using the same shape affecting two different things with different ranges and amounts. How useful is that? So now in addition to pitch wavering, we're gonna actually have a loudness wavering as well. Pretty neat. Let's try loading an effect and changing that effect parameter with a second LFO. One thing that's really fun is to get back into the EQ and start modulating EQs. Let's say I want a slow moving LFO to bring the bass up and cut the bass as this faster LFO is moving the pitch and volume. I can grab a band in my EQ, move it to a bass region here, maybe try and find the most amount of bass that I would want. And then I can modulate the gain of that band in my EQ. I'm gonna right click on the gain, add LFO automation. Now it's gonna already automatically be on 1. We don't want it to be the same speed. We're gonna do a slower LFO. So I'm gonna change this to LFO 2. And if you move the window, you can see that you really get the full picture here of the speed that you're going and the severity, the amount of that modulation. So I'm gonna make it even slower. I'm gonna change my bias to center, and I'm gonna tighten up the range here. This dotted line, by the way, represents where the slider is currently set without modulation. So I'm gonna use where it was set as the max of my fluctuation, right? We kind of picked where the most bass would be, and I'm gonna try this. So here's what this sounds like. More bass, less bass. So it's giving me a little bass boost. And of course you can sync this LFO too, so it's a division of the other one. We can have it do whole notes. It's that simple. You can really get creative with this. Try messing with the amount of time on a reverb trail, or maybe the feedback amount on a delay. Almost every changeable parameter in Soundpaint has this LFO modulating control. So get creative. Now LFOs are kind of a automated modulation, right? I'm not doing anything with my hands here and things are moving on the screen. But maybe I want to modulate stuff using a control surface. Some of the more astute viewers might have noticed that when I right-clicked on a slider, you see it says Add Midi CC Automation. We've talked about Midi CCs before. It's the language in which your controller speaks to Soundpaint. And if you look at your controller, whatever your Midi surface is, you might see a variety of knobs and wheels and sliders. In most cases, every one of those control surfaces is assigned to a Midi CC number. So if I want to change something using a controller on my keybed, using the mod wheel, instead of clicking LFO automation, I would click Midi CC automation. You're going to notice that we have a similar dialogue to the LFO automation. We have a range, we have reverse behavior, but there's no wave shapes. There's no frequencies, because this is not going to be an automatic modulation. This is going to be one that you change as the player. Now, to tell Soundpaint which surface you want to control the behavior, all you have to do is move it. Move and play MIDI controller. You can see that our CC is set to none, just 2 dashes. But as soon as I touch my mod wheel, watch what happens on screen. It changes to CC1, the assigned number of that control. And now if you look at our tone slider, it moves in conjunction with my mod wheel. And this is good for just about any surface here. If I touch these little sliders on here, that's CC14, CC38, but I'm gonna keep it with the mod wheel. Let's just do CC1. Now I have control over my part with the mod wheel. And much like the LFOs, you can assign it to multiple things. So let's pull up a reverb, right? Let's do a shimmer reverb. Let's say I only want to hear the shimmer reverb as I'm making the tone brighter. So when it's nice and closed down, I don't want any reverb, but I'd like to start to hear some reverb as the sound becomes harsher. We can go to our wet dry control. I would right click on that slider, add Midi CC automation, and I can once again say, I want my mod wheel, and instantly it takes effect. And let's say I just want a little bit, just a little bit. Now that motion is going to be moving 2 parameters at different ranges. You see, I have this set only slightly to 14%, and the tone is 100%. And they'll both move together to give me something really, really very musical. that cool? We can also use Midi CCs to control parameters within our LFOs. I can go to our LFO module and choose one, which is controlling the pitch and the volume here. And I can right-click on the amount slider and add a Midi CC to that too. This is where your bias is really going to come into play, because if I'm changing the amount from 0 to something, the sliders will have to rest somewhere when it's at 0. So for pitch, make sure it's using the center one. If you're trying to have something rise, you might want to do bottom up. Now I can see that currently my amount slider is set to 0.83. I like how much it's vibrating, so I'm going to move the top of my range to that point, and I'm going to make sure that my range on its lowest point is set to 0. Now when I move the mod wheel, you'll notice that things stop vibrating because I've just pulled the amount to 0. So now what I have is a mod wheel controlling the darkness to brightness motion of one part, controlling the amount of a shimmer reverb, and controlling the amount of an LFO that's currently set to modulate the volume and the micro pitch of my part, while having a second consistent LFO milking the bass region in an EQ. And the end result is something really, really musical. So a quick recap. Almost every parameter in Soundpaint can be modulated with either an LFO or a Midi CC controller. You can have up to 8 different LFOs or low frequency oscillators, and single LFOs can affect multiple things at different amounts at the same time. And if it's hard to keep track of what's moving what, and you need to visually see that, we have this lovely button over to the right called Matrix, which stands for Automation Matrix. Boom! There it all is. You can see under source what's modulating the affected parameter here. And if you want to see it in depth, you can click to see what each slider range looks like. Now there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet in this interface, and that's this toggle here, velocity note response. We're all about velocities in Soundpaint, and you know from the previous videos that velocities come in a range of 1 to 127. If I want to use my velocity to affect something in addition to the actual velocities that come with your instruments, I can do that using the Midi CC automation menu. Let's say I want to add some distortion when I really, really nail a note. I can go into my effects section, add an analog distortion, and right-click on the wet-dry control, click Add Midi CC Automation, and instead of moving a parameter, I'm just simply going to click Velocity Note Response, which means if I hit it very lightly, doesn't move that much, but if I hit it a little harder, moves quite a bit. And if I nail it, it goes to the full length of my set range. So you can use velocity to control parameters as well. If we head back to our matrix, you will see that now we have a velocity source going to the wet-dry of our analog distortion. So that covers LFO, assigning Midi CCs to modulation destinations, and that leaves one more type of modulation. The parameter that I'm talking about is called Morph. The reason I consider Morph to be modulation is because by definition, Morph is taking the sound of one part and playing it through the sound of another part. It is technically frequency modulation in definition and allows you to get some really, really cool effects. So why don't we pull up one of these and see how it's utilizing Morph? Here's one called Fairies by Mr. Nick Semrad. What we have on the left is a 1928 Steinway piano. This is a simple sustain part, and on the right we have a sound effects library called Free ASMR, which is free, by the way. You'll notice that the sound mode on the left is default and the sound mode on the right is one note stretch. The Morph control happens happens in the center here. And you can see that we can choose from morphing right to left or left to right. You'll see that some controls get grayed out, showing which part is the master or encompassing part, morphing the other one into it. We also have a slider that allows you to control how much of this morph effect you'd like. Let's take a listen to this program and hear what it sounds like. For the sake of simplicity, so you can really hear the morph effect, I'm going to turn off the shimmer reverb so you can just hear the two parts morphing into one another. Do you hear how the piano is being modulated by the percussive effect from free ASMR? You're hearing like almost a bip, bop, bip, bop. That is the percussive element existing within the piano. For demonstration's sake, I'm going to turn Morph off so that you can hear what it sounds like when Morph is not active. It sounds like two separate effects happening at the same time because that's what it is. The piano sounds nice and steady. No modulation. And it's being accompanied by this free ASMR sound. But when we activate Morph, those little like boop, 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 boop in the ASMR library, happen within the piano. Let's play with some parameters here so we can hear what it sounds like when we move the slider around. So when we go all the way to the side of the sound effect, the free ASMR part, we can hear basically just what it's doing to the piano. It's like we're turning the wet to 100% on the morph effect on the piano. Now let's change the morph direction. Let's put the slider back in the center and remind ourselves what that sounds like. And change the direction. Now the dominant sound is the sound effect. And we get a little bit of a plume from the characteristic of a piano sustain existing inside of it. So Morph is one sound literally existing inside of another. One part existing inside of another part. It is a two-part affair only. You cannot morph three parts somehow, but you can do up to 4 morphed parts. You can see that we have a toggle for 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. I would say this parameter is best used when you have two sounds that you want to work together and playing them at the same time just isn't congealed enough. You want to create some crazy hybrid situation where one is truly affecting the DNA of the other. When I'm programming, I love to just turn it on with whatever parts I have loaded and just see what I get, because sometimes the result is absolutely magic. Like this rain one here. I love this because what Trolls has done is he's assigned an LFO to the morph of 2 1928 sustain parts, 1 normal mic and 1 player mic position. So we're gonna get sort of a distancing effect. What's being morphed is actually the ambience of the recording space. So experiment with Morph, put sounds into other sounds, change the direction, change the amount, maybe add an LFO or a Midi CC to the slider. It is one of the most fun things to mess around with in Soundpaint and can yield some truly unique and interesting results. So 3 ways to modulate in Soundpaints: LFOs, low frequency oscillators, Midi CC controls, or Morph. Anyway, that's all I have time for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Shimmy signing out. Take care.